I see folks are trickling in. Hi, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us here today. We're here to discuss Emily Bass's new book, To End a Plague, America's Fight to Defeat AIDS in Africa. I'm Laura Cremer. I'm an associate editor here at N+1 magazine, and I had the pleasure of editing Emily's first essay for N+1 about 6 years ago now. It was a piece called How to Survive a Footnote. And kind of like this book, it wove together a personal account of Emily's relationship to HIV and AIDS work over the years and a broader history of the way the movement kind of evolved. Both of the stories begin in queer activist circles in the United States in the 1990s and move outward to look at the way global aid programs like PEPFAR reshaped the movement after the turn of the century. We're also joined by Abdul-Aliy Muhammad, who's an organizer, activist, and writer based in Philadelphia. Their work on issues surrounding bodies, memory, memorialization, and HIV puts them in conversation with a lot of Emily's work, and both Abdul-Aliy and Emily are part of the collective What Would an HIV Doula Do? I'm really excited to hear from you both about how you're thinking about this book, how you're thinking about issues like activism, pandemic, HIV, AIDS, and historical memory in this particular historical moment. And if you in the audience have specific questions you'd like us to discuss, please drop them, not in the chat. You can't drop them in the chat, but there's a Q&A function specifically where you can put questions. We'll see them and we'll take those questions toward the end of the discussion. There'll also be a link to Emily's book in the chat, which you can buy in the N+1 store. And we encourage you to check that out as well. Emily, would you like to kick us off by sharing a little bit from the book and then talking about the book as a whole?
Sure. Thank you so much. I am so excited to be here in community and in conversation tonight. I'm just really thrilled. So thank you. I brought a piece to N+1 years ago that was sparked by, as many of my pieces are, by being kind of cranky about the way that a story was being told. And the story at that point was about President Museveni in Uganda having made homosexuality a capital offense and failure to report homosexuality a capital offense. And that law being passed, which was horrific and abhorrent and is horrific and abhorrent in any context where that kind of criminalization exists, sparked a lot of responses, including responses saying, well, you know, Uganda is really homophobic and so is the AIDS program that operates there. You know, that is funded by the US government, and maybe the US government paid for this. And I had been working on this program as an activist for years and working to see it sort of impelled into action. And so I was kind of annoyed by that version of history and brought a piece to N+1 that was about being annoyed. And this deft, wonderful editor, Laura, was like, could you just explain sort of how these movements diverged and maybe, you know, sort of what is the history of queer activism and AIDS activism? And then within that, domestic AIDS activism and global AIDS activism, and what is the history of globally oriented American AIDS activism? And writing that piece helped me to figure out the history that I needed to tell in this book. So I'm really moved to be here. And Abdul-Aliy and I are fellow members of a collective called What Would an HIV Doula Do? That asks questions about viruses, about epidemics, about bodies, about identity, about place and memory. And so to be in conversation tonight is incredibly special. And place matters. And so I'm gonna, and the place in question tonight, at least, there are many places, but the place in question tonight is West Philadelphia. And I'm gonna read a couple of sections that kind of put that in context. And I'm gonna start with a section I did not know who was going to be here, so it's always fun to see who turns up. But and I guess even in these contexts, I'm going to ask consent. So JD, I'm going to start with this. I was going to start with a section that features you, which I hope is okay. And we got oh boy, which I think technically is not consent. Thanks. Okay, I think we're gonna go with thanks. So we're gonna just do a little West Philly. We're in the late 90s. And I think after I read a couple sections, there'll be some clarity about maybe why we're here. In January 1999, I met J.D. Davids for the first time at the conference on retroviruses and opportunistic infections. To stretch the HIV plus budget, this is the magazine that I worked for at the time, My editor and I shared a room. To stretch his even more minimal budget, David's bunked with us, bringing a pile of plaid shirts, black jeans, and protest tees that were hardly adequate against Chicago's frigid cold. The hottest talk at the conference came from a German-American virologist named Beatrice Hahn, who announced she'd identified a close relative of human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV. It had come from the frozen cadaver of a Cameroonian chimpanzee named Marilyn, who had been captured and held at Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico for years. Simian immunodeficiency virus does not cause disease in monkeys, but at some point the virus leapt from chimps to humans and acquired its virulent form. Showing spiky family trees of genetic relatedness, Hahn declared that Marilyn had carried in her blood something close to the origin of AIDS. One afternoon, a shaggy-haired man in a rumpled suit came flying toward David's and me in the conference center hallway. He was from the Rainforest Action Network, he said. Hahn was going to receive an award for her research, and he wanted to use the opportunity to call attention to the rapacious forces that threatened Marilyn's descendants' habitats. Over breakfast with David's, he explained the risks posed by the trade liberal, you can't say it, you shouldn't write it, right? Trade liberalizing legislation known as the African Growth and Opportunity Act, and by a World Bank funded Chad Cameroon oil pipeline that posed risks to people, non-human primates, and the land. As David's recalled, the RAIN organizer explained why AIDS activists, quote, why AIDS activists should care about trade policy. It was the first such conversation David's would have, and for him, it tied the inequities of West Philadelphia back to the West African region from whence so many Black Americans' ancestors had come against their will. I'm just gonna read a little bit. So in Philly, in West Philly, at this time in the late 90s, there's a vibrant, unusual, in the context of sort of American ACT UP chapters, a unique ACT UP chapter, ACT UP Philly. And ACT UP Philly is more diverse in terms of life experiences, in terms of racial identities, gender identities, class, you know, than almost any other ACT UP chapter I'm aware of, and it's a very, very special place. And I have to tell you, I have applications crashing while I'm doing this. So if we crash, I'll just come back on my phone. So, but let's talk about ACT UP Philly while I'm with you. And then JD will play, you know, a song if I drop. The ACT UP Philadelphia chapter was filled with people whose bodies and lives reflected this legacy of extraction, colonial extraction, right? Including the uneven distribution of quality healthcare that its members called America's medical apartheid. In the late 1990s, its legion of members included John Bell, a straight Black veteran living with HIV, may he rest in power, Kiyoshi Kuromiya, who'd been born in a Japanese internment camp and had gone on to become an anti-war civil rights activist and co-founder of the Philadelphia chapter of the Gay Liberation Front, rest in power, Kiyoshi, and Joyce Hamilton, a Black woman living with HIV, who joined the group after seeing one of its protests against an impending statewide plan to move Medicaid recipients into cost and corner-cutting HMOs that would not provide quality care to people living with HIV. Asia Russell, a white activist from Silver Spring, Maryland, who had gravitated toward ACT UP Philadelphia as a teenager, paid close attention to the teachings from these and many other members. In ACT UP Philadelphia, we were always trained to think about the hidden spaces, she said. The group fought for the rights of prisoners with HIV concealed behind bars. Another campaign involved fighting back against Clinton-era cuts to social welfare systems. There's another quote from Asia. Connecting the end of food stamps as we knew them to a life with dignity for people living with HIV. That's what drew me to AIDS activism, that electrifying connection. So that's ACT UP Philly, and there's like a bunch of like electrifying connections there, right? Like the Rainforest Action Network guy, who, as far as I know, sort of then disappears. I've never seen him again, but like he does come racing up, and this conversation starts with JD, and it's about listening, right? And you know, new people coming in and making these connections, and then ACT UP Philly, which is engaging with American medical apartheid, also begins to engage with global medical apartheid, which at that point is taking the form of enormous unconscionable inequities in access to AIDS medications that save lives. So by 1999, effective treatment for HIV has existed for 3 years, triple combination therapy, and it is only available to wealthy people or people living in wealthy nations with access to some kind of healthcare. So there are gross inequities, and there are millions of people living around the world in low-income settings and in America in low-income communities or reliant on our fragmented safety net who don't have access. So this connection gets made, right? And it gets made in West Philly in a very particular way. So I'm just going to read a little bit more, and then we're going to talk about all these connections. This is from a different chapter, and it features another member of Active Philly. To lure people, chapter 2, to lure people to move to Philadelphia, Paul Davis and his fellow anarchists offered a range of enticements, including a bike, a room in a squat house, 6 dates, $5, and sometimes a spot in whatever band J.D. Davids was currently playing in. Davis himself was ensconced in Knot Squat, a Baltimore Avenue row house with a deep porch whose black whorled pillars were for a time striped with police tape yellow. A bundle of twigs stood in for a banister. The ground floor air was heavy with the smell of cumin and legumes from Mariposa Cooperative up the street. To keep up the steady drumbeat of media outreach, the squat, this is for their AIDS activism, the squat had landlines aplenty, all ready to jack into computers for late night faxing. Some of you, those words don't actually mean anything, but I don't want to hear from you. I'll tell you later. That's a thing. In early 2001, as Davis and other Health Gap members continued sending faxes and press releases about drug pricing and profiteering, he realized the movement had to start working on its next demand. Holy shit, he thought, we need another thing. So what's happened is that there's been a steady set of activist demands and amazing victories centered on drug companies and the trade-related intellectual property issues that the Rainforest Action guy raised that really are basically saying you cannot set the prices of these drugs at the profiteering level that is $10,000, $12,000 a year, and then claim that is where the lowest that they can be. You have to allow generic manufacturing. You have to allow countries and companies with the ability to make cheaper versions to do so. You have to allow a market to exist so that the prices come down, and they're winning. Right? There's a lot of stuff that happens between Rainforest Guy and Knot Squat. Okay. In the months after the July 2000 Durban AIDS conference, the price of antiretroviral medications had come tumbling down. The media savvy activist movement had persuaded the press and the public that price gouging on essential medications was morally unconscionable and that access to AIDS medications was a human right. In late 2000, the Indian drug manufacturer Cipla sought compulsory licensing for 6 antiretroviral drugs held under patent by major pharmaceutical companies. These companies responded that they needed more time. When Cipla began to export its versions of the antiretrovirals lamivudine and zidovudine to Uganda, Glaxo Wellcome dispatched a letter telling the company to cease and desist, writing, quote, intellectual property protection is essential to sustain the investment needed for discovery and development of new treatments for HIV, AIDS, and other diseases affecting the Western world. It's not, actually, because a lot of those drugs were developed in academic labs or by the government and then given to drug companies. Cipla did not stop. Instead, in February 2001, the company pushed further, announcing that it would make and sell antiretrovirals for less than $1 per person per day. That was when Davis and others realized that the world needed a thing that would buy and distribute the cheap medications. Sitting around in Philly, this is Davis talking, we did some cursory Alta Vista searches and realized no one was set up to pay for the AIDS drugs, Davis recalled, naming the search engine popular at the time. Again, some of you, this may be news. Or not. You may remember it. I don't know. We can talk about it all. The activists thought that the US government was a poor choice. Its pro-patent stance, along with the Agency for International Development's Buy American stipulation, would make procurement of generics difficult, as would USAID's opposition to antiretroviral treatment. Because at this time, our premier development agency is saying we can't treat Africans with HIV. We can't do it. It's not sustainable. It's too expensive. We can't do it. Same agency that we have to hold accountable for COVID today, all right? Nor was USAID or any single country's development agency the right entity to serve as the purchaser and distributor of pills to treat a global pandemic. If any single funder took charge, decisions about what to buy would be left in the hands of donor nations, not the recipient countries themselves. The World Bank seemed like a possibility, but when Davis asked around, he realized it was part of what his peers in the anti-globalization movement considered a neoliberal axis of evil. So I'm going to stop there. But I think the point's probably clear. It's these activists' actions speak for themselves, right? But what happens, right, is there the thing is proposed. There is an idea about what to do, and it's a global fund that exists to this day. And that thing and the prices coming down then prompt action by the White House, which also wants to do something, but wants to do something in its own way. And that becomes the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, or PEPFAR, which is the subject of the book in many ways. But if we start the story with George Bush, and I admit I do, we start the book with George Bush as the creator, and we don't start the story with J.D. Davids and Paul Davis and Kiyoshi Kurimiya and Joyce Hamilton and John Bell and a legion of other people I'm not naming, and we don't make those connections, what happens? What happens if PEPFAR starts in the White House, and what happens if it starts in West Philadelphia, right? And how does that change our sense of obligation and ownership and accountability? So I'm so happy I got to ask those questions, and I'm so happy I get to be here in conversation with you, and thank you for listening.
Great. Thanks for sharing those passages and kind of orienting us to, in particular, kind of the jumping off point, I think, of your narrative, which then ends up traveling farther afield. I think now would be a good time. I mean, I have a lot of follow-up questions that I hope we'll get to about all the connections you've just drawn. But Abdul-Aliy, do you want to start us off talking a little bit about your own work in the present day and your thoughts about kind of this history grounded, as you've said, Emily, in Philly, where you're working now, and how you feel like this these historical threads connect to present activism work that you're involved with, or that the two of you are involved with and talking about in the collective that you're part of.
Sure, thank you, Emily. This book is it's great. It's like weaves histories and things that I remember about that neighborhood, because that's the neighborhood that I grew up in. I grew up on 50th and Pintridge. So right around the corner from what used to be the Firehouse Farmers Market, which you're probably familiar with, which JD is probably familiar with. I probably passed Not Squat
Yep.
many times, which I believe was at 48th in Baltimore, maybe around
JD's
there.
got to fact check this.
Yeah, but there's a lot of squats on Baltimore Avenue, and I recall like you talking about the yellow tape. I recall that. As a child. And for me, it brings up also my connectedness to HIV work, even before I tested positive in 2008, in December of 2008. My mother, Melody Beverly, she worked at We the People, which was located on Lombard Street, which had like housing units on top of it. And I recall going there after school, volunteering, just helping out in the kitchen, because they had a kitchen upstairs. And I really loved the biscuits they had. I don't know where they got these biscuits from, but they were so good. And I recall my first encounter with stigma, with HIV stigma, and this is before I tested positive. I was at Shaw Middle School, which is in Southwest Philly. And I was talking to people about just how excited I was to just volunteer at my mom's job, and that my mother worked in HIV at an organization, an AIDS organization. And I remember one of the students, one of the fellow students of mine, was like shocked and like, "Oh, you're working around people with AIDS?" And I was pretty young at that point, didn't really understand why this person was so like shocked about that. But it was definitely my first encounter with someone who had a fearful reaction to being around people who were HIV positive. And so this book made me think about my mother who passed. It brought up so many feelings. So I appreciate you for this work, because it's important to surface the groundwork that you talk about that leads to something like a PEPFAR. That I was a baby when all of these conversations happened, but these conversations deeply impacted the work that I do now as an organizer. A few years ago, I and some other people in HIV organizations created the Black and Brown Workers Cooperative, which deeply is indebted to the legacy of ACT UP, right? We really are about political theater and how to make our direct actions theatrical to get demands met. And so when we formed, we were studying tactics of ACT UP, right? From the action where ashes were thrown over the White House fence to kind of the actions in New York City. It was one at a church, that big action at a church that we talked about a lot. And because a lot of people, including myself, had a deep connection to HIV, I think that we definitely look to ACT UP in similar formations for guidance. And so this is really, reading your book, talking about the 90s, it made me think of like all those things and how I was in that world and didn't know it at the time that I would deeply engage with it later, with the histories later. And so you say in this book that place is important, and I think that's true, because I don't think the work of the Black and Brown Workers Cooperative could have happened anywhere else. Like, it had to happen in Philly because of all the legacies that you say and talk about in this book. And I guess to speak to your writing, when you start off the book, you talk about the war. I recall like being in high school. I'm just thinking back about like, wow, I was young. Being in high school and really having a fear of not having a future during the Bush years. Mm-hmm. And for you to kind of juxtapose that with like this eventual kind of formation of this fund, this global fund, which becomes PEPFAR, was like shocking to me, because I had to like sit with myself and be like, oh, I hate Bush. And also like you said, it's not Bush. It resulted in a White House policy, but all the work that went into it, we owe to people like JD and people who you talk about in South Africa, like Sissy and others. And I think it's truly powerful because in What Would an HIV Doula Do, we talk a lot about how women are erased from AIDS histories, about Black folks not being talked about as much when we talk about histories, that you spend a lot of time uplifting the incredible work, the challenging work of people who don't have access to antiretrovirals in South Africa, and who figure out how to organize in that context, which is so deeply important to our histories.
I mean, I think that, there's so much there. One of the things about the 90s and just thinking about place and thinking about West Philly in particular, and I was a New York-based activist, so I was taking train down there. And like, if you took Amtrak, it was called the Princess Train. And if you took it took 3 hours longer, but you could do it by New Jersey Transit and something else. But like, we're in the 90s in New York, undergoing like a wave of gentrification and a wave of Giuliani era, clean up the city, corporatize, Disneyfy Times Square, and rent becomes complex for a lot of people. And one of the reasons that you can have Philadelphia be so active, I think, right? And you talk about squats and you talk about land trust houses and you talk about like, we'll give you a room and a bike. And like, there's other things like Paul Davis would rebuild computers, he said, like activism needs spaces where people can afford to live and can afford to put their energy into activism. And there's sort of two parts to that, right? Is like, where is the activism needed? Well, probably in places where, their system, I mean, it's needed everywhere, but definitely the sense of West Philly being a place where there was a lot of energy and New Yorkers would move down, those of us that were up here to sort of be part of that energy and also do organizing here. Something I wanted to bring into this story because it does then move to Uganda and it does move to South Africa. But at a moment when we're dealing with a global pandemic right now, I think this idea that that local activism can and could take on issues that transformed the global response to a pandemic, so both in the US and abroad, that it's possible, and that part of that possibility was actually impelling the government to act, right? And that you do actually secure a win from the system. You don't burn the system down, but you secure a win from the system, and you're an anarchist while you're doing it is like a very complex, or you're whoever you are while you're doing it, is a complex reality, to hold. So I'll stop talking for a minute. See, Laura, if you want to chime in. JD has facts to share. Not Squat had been a squat called Hell Squat, but by the time this was all happening, it was literally not a squat because people bought it at a sheriff's sale. But yes, it was a very, very cheap place to live. Three varies. Fair enough.
Yeah, I mean, so actually the next kind of two questions I was going to ask you, I think are kind of things that you just alluded to. I mean, one is like, I definitely want to hear more about, the international story that's in this book, and specifically about the way that it tells the story partly of connections between activists in the United States and in African countries, or, work by activists in both of these places. Like, what do you think this story has to offer us in thinking about ways to build an international movement like this that's not just about kind of activists in the United States getting the American government to impose something on people around the world, for example, but is ideally, this sort of more collaborative project. And also, I mean, I think the tension that you alluded to and that I saw definitely in the original piece, and that is here too, between, I think you said, burning the system down and using it. There's a great quote at the end of the book, toward the end of the book, where you say, I think there are no simple happy endings to pandemics, and there never will be until the structures that cause them are dismantled and rebuilt. And I think my sense is that you kind of narrativize your own shifting attitude toward this question throughout the book. The sort of question of like, how much does the whole system have to be torn down, and how much, or in what cases, can it be mobilized for radical ends, say like by activists instead? And I would love to hear more of your thoughts about both of those things.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and it is one that I was grappling with when I was writing the book. The critique of PEPFAR, particularly, but sort of AIDS focused programs in general, but then particularly PEPFAR, is like, it's a huge amount of money to do one specific thing, and really most of the money is spent on treating people with HIV in 14 countries, most of which are in sub-Saharan Africa, and it's expanded. And yes, you hear these stories that have to do with really noxious earmarks for abstinence until marriage education and various other things, but the lion's share of this $15 billion, and that I'm not minimizing this, and the lion's share of the $15 billion over 5 years is the largest disease-specific foreign aid investment in world history by any government, by the US government. And the lion's share of that money is for treating people with HIV, treating mainly adults who have what is largely a sexually transmitted disease or acquired disease, or sometimes it's acquired through drug use or other, but basically Black and brown people in other countries need to have these drugs. And Republicans agree, and queer activists agree, and there's a whole sort of convergence. And then the government, the PEPFAR decides to move really quickly. It decides to move ahead of the Global Fund, which is the thing that Paul Davis comes up with, and other people, many other people, which is multilateral. And it says, no, we got to move really fast. We're going to go in and we're going to run this, for impact, rather than working with governments to build their health systems. And over and over, when I ask people this question in the book, like, is it worth it? What they will say back, whoever they are, right, is a version of, well, for me, someone living with HIV, it was worth it. Or if you ask the people living with HIV, was it the right thing to do to move fast? It was, right? And so you have this kind of, it's not impossible, but it's really tricky, right? Moving fast saved an enormous number of lives, and it built a parallel system. And what is the answer to whether, PEPFAR was adequate, and AIDS funding is adequate? the answer is COVID, right? The answer is a pandemic that's ravaging countries where HIV programming has been supported for years by PEPFAR and the Global Fund. We did not build a robust, resilient health system that works for everybody here or abroad. And so at the same time, lives were saved, right? And people were returned to, and I read a lot about this in the book too, that not dying of AIDS doesn't mean that the other things that are affecting you, extreme poverty, lack of access to contraception, to abortion if you need it, homophobia, all of those things don't go away, but you're not dying of AIDS. And so PEPFAR, answers this question in one way. And I think that we're at this moment where we have to figure out how to sustain PEPFAR to keep answering that question, right? To keep funding a global AIDS response and a domestic AIDS response, because AIDS is ongoing in America, and HIV is ongoing in America. And so we're creating history and living in a present pandemic. And to look at what we do differently with funding and ambition to do that isn't a PEPFAR-esque model. And JD put a question in the Q&A, which is, are there currently alliances between environmental groups like Rainforest Action Network and global treatment access, vaccine access groups? And there's at least one that I know of, right, which is the Right to Health Action Coalition, that is actively seeking to bring together folks directly impacted by COVID and folks working on the front lines of the issue of like outbreaks happen and spillovers happen because of environmental degradation. Same issue that was raised with us in 1999. Like, this is not new. Sort of bringing those groups into coalition and then trying to get the government and other governments to be ambitious and spend a lot of money, and not just spend it on vaccine stockpiles, although that is important, but to also spend it on the programs that keep the forest from being cut down and that stop the collapse of the planet, because these things are totally intertwined. So it's R2H Action. I'll put it in the chat. There may be folks from it on the call who can also drop in things or come off mute. But making these common causes, I think, is the next big. It's sort of the existential challenge that faces us, right?
Yeah, great. I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add to that, Abdul-Aliy. Otherwise, I can.
Yeah, sure. I'm sorry. I was like trying to figure out when to jump in.
Always. Jump in always.
Sorry, I muted myself, but yeah, jump in whenever.
Thank you. Something that struck me in what you wrote is, I think you were in South Africa and you wrote that solidarity seems easy in a crowd.
Mm-hmm.
And that line really stuck with me because it made me think about the past year, about the pandemic year, about the uprisings, and about all of that energy, that energetic space that people were in, in the aftermath of Breonna Taylor's murder, of George Floyd's murder, and so many others being murdered by the hands of the state. And how do we, and it also like, just it seemed almost kind of like, I wouldn't say surreal, but magical, your description of how that first meeting of international, of people from all over the world in Durban in 96?
2000.
2000, and how that had been the first time that these folks had been together, but I'm guessing had been on that internet. What is that? Not, it wasn't Google. On the search engine,
Alta Vista.
On the search engine of time, yeah. Bygone times, and it made me think of Kiyoshi's work with Critical Path, with the newsletter, and with just how intense it might have been for people to really communicate and be together, and then to be in a space for the first time to have an in-person conversation, and how robust and how like intense that moment might have been. But when you go back to your spaces, or when a year passes, like how do you hold on to, how do you retain that same energetic fire to continue to do this work, which oftentimes takes so long? I mean, according to like our time frames, or like you said, people are dying, so it is too long if people are continuing to die. But also a very short history. I don't know if this is jumbled or makes sense, but
no, it makes total sense. But I really, I'm so glad that you brought that up, because we are dealing in this, right? We're dealing with all of these sort of they're not untold, they're out there, but sort of unassembled pieces of a history, right? And so I just want to ask you, if you brought in Kiyoshi's work as a pioneer of sort of, freedom of the internet and intellectual, freedom, but also like sharing information. If you want to just say a little bit more about that, because I actually don't write about that in the book, but it's hugely important.
Yeah, absolutely. From what I understand, Kiyoshi and others, Kiyoshi had a vast network of people, of comrades, of allies, of folks globally, and Kiyoshi produced a newsletter which was with information from scientists, from studies that would go out to everyone. And what was revolutionary about it is that it would happen in like real time, or as quick as possible then, when the internet was still young. And from what I've been told from people who knew Kiyoshi's space was always lively with conversation, and it was always something happening, something being discussed. And I can only imagine that in the 90s, before, highly active antiretroviral therapy, the need for new information or to be on top of information was something that could help someone live longer. And so I understand that pace was intense and fast for its time, and heavy with new information all the time, which, we can learn a lot about or from, given, what's happening in COVID. And it's work that we do as the, what would an HIV doula do? I mean, we've spent this whole past pandemic year kind of in deep conversations on Zoom, and like producing a lot of zines about how we felt in our bodies, about COVID, about uprisings. So it just, it's making me make those connections.
Yeah, and the reason I'm looking down is I'm just looking to sort of get facts and timing straight, which I'll drop in the chat later. But Kiyoshi's work in sort of creating an internet-based forum, so Critical Path and listservs. We loved listservs back in the day. We loved them as much as we loved Alta Vista and landlines. Just loved a good listserv. And they're all still there. So speaking of like researching books and amazing stuff, you go into you can back into listservs, Critical Path listservs, if you know the URL, from the 90s, and just go through what people were talking about, which I did in the book. But Kiyoshi's work on sharing information about HIV and safe sex and sexual pleasure and all those things ended up in a decency case around internet freedom and free speech, and that went to the Supreme Court, right? So again, like what happens if we put that in the history, right? And decency, and then the Christian conservatives, and Bush and the White House. I mean, all of these pieces are connected. I'm good at watching the time, and I see it's sort of quarter of. So I would just wonder if there are folks that want to come off mute and bring other people or other stories into the conversation, bring questions, or drop them in the chat. If you know me, I'll just keep talking.
I mean, we definitely welcome any questions you want to drop into the Q&A. If not, I have plenty of more questions, but definitely feel free, anybody who's in the audience, to chime in. I can ask while we're waiting. Well, I have a couple different questions. One, I think that we've kind of touched on already, but not addressed explicitly, maybe, is the sort of obvious question of like, how do we think about this narrative, or what can this history tell us about our current moment, about COVID? I noticed pretty early on in the COVID-19 pandemic, actually, a lot of people, of sort of different political orientations, like, were trying to make very different kinds of points, like drawing an analogy between COVID-19 and HIV, and between those pandemics. And I would just be really curious to hear your thoughts about, like, in what ways, drawing those connections or those analogies, like, are and aren't helpful, or like, in what ways it might be, important to think about these things together, and what ways it might be misleading, what lessons can we learn, anything in that realm, both from the specific history of kind of like the fight that you describe in this book, and more in general.
Yeah, I have a couple answers, then I want to hear Abdul-Aliy's. I mean, I think this book is like way more relevant than I wanted it to be. Right? Like that, like I would prefer to have this be like just of interest to folks working on ongoing HIV/AIDS. We're in the midst of something that I still can't wrap my head around. And want to name and hold space for all the ways that the pandemic has affected all of our lives, including the fact that we're doing this on Zoom, and all of the losses, right? That's a lot. But the book is about what is possible and what I think is possible again. And I think that that's also important, and that we just lived through, under the Trump administration, a destruction of faith in government, a destruction of the idea of bipartisan compromise, of bipartisan collaboration, and we're in just an incredibly divided moment with a pandemic, as pandemics always do, running along the fault lines of that division. And I think you have to have both rage and hope, or rage and optimism, or rage and maybe delusion to be an activist, right? But there's part of me that's like, well, no, it happened once, it can happen again. The Bush era was not a good time. It was not, it was divided, and we were doing horrible things and about to do even more horrible things, and yet different groups came together and said this is possible, and the president agreed, and something happened, and the inevitable became, the impossible became inevitable. But I was in another conversation recently, and one of the people that I was talking with in that space, who works in a sort of policy world and polls, and made a point that I'm still turning over. And that is that the difference between HIV and COVID is that the vast majority of the American public thinks we should work on HIV, and sort of, it isn't an issue that they vote on, right? They love, global AIDS is nice, but you're not going to lose or win an election, right? Your COVID response is an electoral issue. If you're the president, if you're a senator, if you're a representative. So you've got that piece of it, right? Like George Bush, when he launches PEPFAR, is about to send troops into Iraq. It's post 9/11. He's got a gonzo approval rating. The media is printing lies. He's bulletproof, right? As it were, in terms of what he's trying. It's still hard to do that big a foreign aid program. That's not the case with COVID. And the other thing that was sort of observed to me that I found really powerful to think about is that the level of fear is different, and that people are afraid right now of what's going to happen. Can my kids stay in school? Will there be enough vaccines for me? Will there be enough vaccines for my parents? Will there be enough vaccines for, my frontline worker partner when they need a booster shot? And that fear of what about me? What about mine? Wasn't there when we were doing global AIDS in the same way, right? It wasn't like, if we do HIV treatment overseas, I will not have HIV for the people treatment for the people I love. It's actually like, if the drugs become cheaper, we all benefit. So fear and electoral threat are real differences and real challenges. And what's possible is like the retort, right? That we did this before, and the people that did it are many of them are gone, and many of them are still here. So that's what I got to say. Abdul-Aliy, what do you think?
Yeah, I thank you for that. I didn't think about the electability piece, like around, someone's COVID response doesn't matter electorally. And, as we know from AIDS history, Reagan doesn't respond until years later. And essentially, HIV is largely ignored on the federal level when other people were organizing and taking care of loved ones and people in community. And so I think you're right about this difference in fear, because HIV was seen as, a gay disease, and very specific to a certain community, even though we know HIV can impact all communities and has. I think that the narrative early on kind of created this larger, this story that it didn't really matter, that these people weren't really important to protect or care for, and they're not us. And like, this not us, kind of framing. And I, while you saw that a little bit with how COVID was talked about early on as being, originating in Asia. So xenophobia definitely played a part in people's fears around COVID. But I don't think people were as naive to think that COVID wouldn't impact them in the same ways that people thought about HIV. And then the other thing is that I do think that certain things showed up in our COVID response that has its origins in HIV community activism, like mutual aid. I think a lot of what happened in community was people kind of leaning into, I guess, buying clubs, I guess, structures like that where people support each other. So a lot of those infrastructures, I feel like, are indebted to HIV movement people. And that I don't think was talked enough about in like the mainstream media. And what else was different? Disclosure was different. I mean, disclosing HIV status still today is met with a lot of like vitriol and like hatred. And I saw people in real time disclosing their COVID status and receiving so much love and care, virtually on Twitter. And so that, for me as a POS person, really like stood out. And maybe I don't know enough, but I don't recall HIV positive people being held up as heroes when they survived after HAART was introduced. In the same way that people who survived COVID, it was all these stories which are problematic about like, this 100-year-old person who had got the Spanish flu, survived a COVID diagnosis, but it was I never really saw a story of like, this person who was impacted by HIV survived COVID, like being heroic, like that framework, that narrative, didn't really seem to happen when a person like was an AIDS survivor and got COVID and then lived through it. It was like, this person got the Spanish flu and they survived, and wow, this is amazing. So yeah.
I should turn away to write that down. Why do some diseases make us heroes?
Yeah.
That's such a good question.
Yeah, and I think the last point is that I feel like, and I wrote about this for The Body and for Gran Verones, that we still live in a white supremacist system. So, the most vulnerable are impacted by this pandemic, and that was the same for HIV. And so there is some similarities there and big differences.
Brian Carmichael, not to call you out, but it's only in the panel, so I'm just gonna read it. If you want to come off mute, first of all, big ups to Brian because he named AOL hometown. So some of us are just having a search engine old home week. We can just go, full. Oh my God, I forget it. The one with the boat. But Brian, you said COVID-19 is totally like HIV, like an apple is like an orange. Do you want to talk about that? And you can say no. Totally consensual. I think I'm going to take silence as consensus. Just move on. He can't get off mute.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's how this setup works, but definitely if you want to put your thoughts in the chat or in the Q&A.
Nobody can unmute themselves. Oh my God, free the participants. Be a takeover. JD, do you want to be unmuted?
think I just unmuted myself.
You did. Hey, Brian.
Oh man, I don't have the
Hey,
Zoom
everybody.
skills to do that. But
You did. You did it.
Well, one, I am in awe just to be in this company. And it's nice. I want to say this. For those of you, I don't know how much familiarity you have with like the prison activism in the early days of HIV activism in prison, but so much of that, like all of that, I know from the early days was inspired by like reading about, you know, especially the activism on the East Coast, like Philly and New York, and the international stuff. So even though what was going on in prisons and jails weren't getting any attention in the media, we were definitely inspired by you know, the work of all of you on the streets and, you know, fighting in other trenches. And what I mean by Ted Kerr and I, and I think maybe JD and I had talked before about how this people compared HIV and like Ali so brilliantly just said, there in some things there is no comparison. Like you just asked, why are some diseases heroic, like cancer? Oh, she's a cancer survivor, or he survived cancer and now he's, you know, but nobody says, you know, he's been surviving HIV for 30 years and he saved a cat. But it is a virus. It is a, I see the similarities because when the last pandemic, you know, from some novel virus, I see a lot of similarities like that. I see the similarities in how the government failed to respond and they ignored all the advice of the activists. And here, so famously in New York, we have like the chief medical officer of Rikers months before anyone in government was doing anything, saying you have to close this jail, you have to lower the population, or everyone's going to get COVID, and being ignored for months and months. And the same way that in prison and jails, people were saying like you need to develop a 5-year plan. You can't just segregate people with HIV. That's, you know, sending the wrong message. So I see similarities like that. Like an apple is a fruit and so is an orange, but that's about where the similarities end. And they are both viruses and they are both pandemics. But that's about it for me. I mean, imagine if all the world scientists and all the world labs stopped and said, we will find a vaccine for HIV now. We would have had one, you know, 35 years ago.
Yeah.
I think. And because, you know, it was just mostly those people, I'm doing air quotes if you can't see me, but it was like those people that got HIV and, you know, kind of like they deserve it, or, you know, it wouldn't be much of a loss. You know what I mean? Like that was the white supremacist view. Like, okay, but COVID could affect anyone. You know, how many times do we like interrupted the news? Oh, Tom Hanks has corona. Oh my God. You know, but it's great that they developed a vaccine so rapidly. And even though now, remember, like all the things that they said, an HIV vaccine isn't practical because the virus will mutate and we're going to, you know, you'd have to come out with a new one and a new one. What, like a booster shot?
Yeah.
It's like, if the world would have rallied instead of like this homophobic response that they had to HIV to this day, but if all the world would have stopped and said, we're going to focus on this, and all the, you know, money was dumped into that. Okay, you know.
So Shanti just dropped something in the chat. Brian, I want to say two things. You're a hero. And one of the great things about these conversations is I get to see people that I know that don't necessarily know each other. Brian's a frontline hero from Vacaville, from many, many places, but did frontline life-saving AIDS in prison work in Vacaville prison, which was a site of medical atrocities. And people living with HIV refusing to die silently and taking care of each other is another piece that needs a history that hasn't been written. but you are in the presence of greatness with Brian. So I just really want to thank you for being part of that and for giving me a chance to call your name out and for people to hear your voice. I know we're gonna like get cut off, but JD, like you were invoked and pictured and described, and I just wonder if you have anything you want to say or just want to tell us about your cat.
I want to say that my partner keeps laughing that you guys keep saying my name. Yeah, I think I was thinking, Emily, while you were talking about the differences and similarities about, I feel like it is important to note that, at least from where I was sitting, that it was, once we had at least fairly good access to in activist circles and beyond to HIV treatment in the United States, that we were able to look further ahead, further afield, right? Because there were people like, I remember Eric Sawyer in ACT UP New York and a few others who were fighting and talking about global treatment access, but most of us really weren't. But we would do it like there was a fight to that many people were involved in. There were Haitian people living with HIV who were detained in Guantanamo. So we in ACT UP Philly were part of, trying to get people freed. And so that's an earlier story of like 2 ACT UP Philly members were in a receiving line to shake hands with Bill Clinton and said something to him about need to free the Haitians in Guantanamo. And he said, "Eat shit," to them. But no one else heard it. But so let the record show that as well. But I
put it in the second edition.
Exactly. Yeah. But you know what, when we were going out in Philly and talking with folks about, how there was, when Al Gore was running for president, and there was proof that his office of the vice president had threatened South Africa for updating their legal code to allow for the manufacture of generic drugs you couldn't get otherwise. It was only because, not only because it was, but people reacted very strongly to that because they saw what a difference access to the meds had made in their own communities, and they didn't want their government going around in their name denying access to others. So I don't know what would have happened if Rainforest Action Dude ran up to me, 5 years earlier, right before there was access to treatment, or we don't really know. I think that's actually also part of what's going on now, as you note with COVID, is even people who are sort of more statistically safe and now less likely to become seriously ill or die of COVID because we've had access to vaccines, and also have lower risk now of long COVID, people don't feel safe. And of course, we're much more protected than people who are the masses of people around the world who don't have vaccine access. I think that it stops people from being able to look up and look further away, and also the inability to even get to targets now, so much of the stuff that we did, like people invaded the office of the U.S. Trade Representative physically by climbing up a tree and jumping onto a balcony and taking over her office, was pre 9/11, and the ability to get in buildings, the ability to, do different kinds of direct action, the kind of stuff that's in the, How to Survive a Plague movie. We are in a much further along stage of repression, and control of physical spaces. So some of the advocacy that we did, I wouldn't say it's literally impossible, because I wouldn't know what that would mean literally, but it's much more difficult. And it's hard to imagine. And frankly, it's much more dangerous for people to do, even if they're people with white skin privilege and other stuff, So those are some thoughts I have right now. And I've never heard my name said so much in an hour. So it's been very strange, but thank you. Okay, bye.
Bye.
Bye. I'll be here. Bye.
I mean, Laura, I think you're going to have to corral us into being done, so I'm going to let you do that. But I do just want to say, because it's really nice and circular, Shanti, who is an amazing activist documentary filmmaker. I mean, it's just really the company that I've been able to keep over these years. It's such a privilege. But wrote to the panelists on the Heroes issue, what about Magic Johnson? Not to mention How to Survive a Plague in terms of heroic survival, which is like a great sort of circular way to come back to the beginning, which is like this story began in part because of like, my own experience having lived through an activist moment that started after the credits ran in How to Survive a Plague, right? That is everything that came after the drugs. And so absolutely, I think that we have our heroic narratives, and there are heroes, and there are always untold histories behind those heroes, and there are always the other heroes. And I think within HIV, it's sort of the solution to all of it lies, I think, in continuing to sort of name and lift up and refuse any single canonical narrative, right? So this is part of it, and Brian's part of it, and Abdul-Aliy and JD, and that's it. That's what I got, Laura. Land this plane like you landed my piece years ago.
All right. I mean, this has been so wonderful to hear from all of you, both you, Abdul-Aliy and Emily, and folks who are jumping in. I found both this discussion and the book itself really edifying and also very moving. And I'd encourage you all to check it out. The book, once again, link in the chat if you want to grab a copy. And also this discussion, I think, is going to be posted online. So if you have folks you want to share it with who weren't able to be here tonight, you can share that with them. Again, wonderful to hear from all of you, and hopefully we can continue this discussion in other forums and other fora in an ongoing way.
Subscribe to N+1, because then you'll see my next piece, or maybe it'll be online, which involves HIV, COVID, and bobblehead dolls. It's gonna be so good. Birx and Fauci bobblehead dolls. That's
yes.
Isn't there some a JD David's chat coming up soon, like on the 19th?
There is. There's, if you want more JD Davids, we will find a way to share that out as well. JD and Abdul-Aliy, I think.
Yeah, it's Abdul-Aliy.
Wonderful. Yeah, where can we find you, Abdul-Aliy, if you want to hear more about your work?
You can follow my Twitter. It has a link to my link tree, which has a lot of my writing. I would say Twitter is probably the best place to follow me, and it's MX Abdul-Aliy, and I can share that in the chat.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you again all.
Thank you, guys.
All right. Thank you, Emily. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Stay safe, be well, stay strong.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Have a good weekend, everybody.
You too, Brian.